We need to talk about a blind spot today. I think most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, we have this underlying assumption about how the world works.
Right, this idea that history has a destination.
Exactly. Like as countries get richer and their middle class grows, they inevitably become, well, like us.
You mean Western?
Yeah, Western. We assume they're going to become more democratic, more individualistic, more focused on the rule of law. We basically use modernization and westernization as synonyms, like they are the exact same word.
And that has been the default operating system for Western thinking for at least 50 years. It's the end of history argument.
Right.
That all roads naturally lead to a liberal Western-style democracy.
But what if that Mac you've been using is completely wrong? Today we are doing a deep dive into Martin Jacques' source material, When China Rules the World. And I have to say, this research didn't just challenge my perspective on this. It completely dismantled it.
It's a heavy hitter of a source.
It really is, because the central premise here is that we are moving into a world where China is going to be the dominant power, but, and this is the part that's really hard to wrap your head around, it is not going to become a Western nation while doing it.
No, not at all. And that is the core friction of the whole deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
Jacques uses a massive amount of economic history and cultural analysis to argue that the last 2 centuries of Western dominance, the world we all grew up in, wasn't actually a destiny.
Yeah.
It was an anomaly.
An anomaly. See, that feels like a stretch to me. I mean, look at the last 200 years, the Industrial Revolution, the global economy, the internet. It's all built on Western foundations. How can you call all of that just a blip?
By looking at the timeline of human history and not just the last few chapters, Jacques argues that if you zoom out, the rise of the West was largely due to accidental factors.
Accidental.
Yeah, geography and timing rather than some inherent cultural superiority. And to understand where we're going as a global society, we have to understand how the West actually pulled ahead in the first place.
Okay, so let's go back to the starting line then. I think the general assumption for, most people is that Europe and specifically Britain took over the world in the 1800s because they were just, I don't know, smarter, or at least they had better institutions and better technology.
Right. That's the story we tell ourselves. But the source points to what historians call the 1800 benchmark. And the data here is actually really surprising.
Surprising how?
As late as 1800, the most advanced parts of China, like the Yangtze Delta, and also Japan, by the way, were economically comparable to the most advanced parts of Western Europe.
Wait, when you say comparable, what does that actually look like on the ground? Because I'm picturing London with paved streets and bustling coffee houses, and then rural China with, rice paddies.
Right, and that's the bias speaking. Because in 1800, if you looked at life expectancy, caloric intake, literally just how much food people had to eat every day.
Okay.
And the complexity of their markets, the Yangtze Delta, was neck and neck with Britain. In some metrics like literacy and agricultural efficiency, China was actually ahead.
Really? Ahead of Britain in 1800?
Yes, they had massive commercial networks and a quality of life that would have looked very familiar to a wealthy European at the time.
So it wasn't a case of advanced Europe versus primitive Asia. It was 2 heavyweights standing in the ring, and they were pretty much equal.
Correct. Both were highly advanced agrarian societies. And crucially, both were hitting a ceiling.
A ceiling in what way?
They were running out of land and resources to feed their growing populations.
So if they were neck and neck, why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Manchester and not in Beijing? Why did Britain suddenly strap a rocket to its back while China just stagnated?
Jacques argues it came down to 2 massive strokes of luck. The first one was coal.
Coal?
Yeah, Britain had huge accessible deposits of coal right near its population centers and waterways. It was easy to dig up and easy to move around.
And China didn't have coal?
They did have coal, but it was mostly in the Northwest. That's far away from the economic hubs in the South. And it was incredibly difficult to transport.
Okay, so geography matters. But just having coal nearby doesn't explain global domination.
No, it doesn't. The real game changer, the second stroke of luck, was the New World, the colonization of the Americas.
Ah, right. The source mentions this term ghost acreage. It sounds like a horror movie title, but I take it refers to land you don't actually see.
It's a brilliant economic concept, actually. Think about it this way. By 1830, Britain was importing massive amounts of cotton, sugar, and timber from the Americas.
Right.
If Britain had tried to grow all those resources within its own borders, it would have required about 25 to 30 million acres of land.
Which is, how much is that in context?
That is more than Britain's total arable and pasture land combined.
Wow. So Britain basically built an extension on its house that was bigger than the house itself.
Precisely. They outsourced their resource constraints, they used the land of the Americas, and we absolutely have to be clear here, the slave labor that worked it.
Of course.
Feed their industrial machine. And this allowed Britain to switch its own workforce from farming to manufacturing.
Meanwhile, China didn't have a new world to exploit.
No. China had to grow everything within its own borders. They were trapped. They had to throw more and more labor into agriculture just to feed their massive population.
So while Britain poured resources into building machines, China poured labor into pure survival.
Exactly.
That brings us to this concept of the high-level equilibrium trap. I found this fascinating because it suggests China didn't fail to industrialize because it was backward. It failed because it was too efficient.
Yes, it's like the manager's dilemma. Imagine you run a business in 1800. You need to move 1,000 pounds of grain.
Okay.
You could spend a fortune trying to invent and build a steam-powered conveyor belt. Or, because the population's so huge and efficient, you can just hire 50 men for pennies to carry it. Which do you do?
You hire the men. The machine is way too expensive and risky.
Right. There is no economic incentive to innovate. In Britain, labor was expensive, and they had cheap energy from coal and cheap resources from the colonies. So the only way for them to make a profit was to invent machines that saved labor.
So China's efficiency actually became its cage. They were so good at the old way, they couldn't pivot to the new way.
And that stagnation led to a massive collision. We have to talk about the Macartney mission of 1793.
Oh, yes. This is the moment where these two worlds, the rising West and the stagnant East, really look each other in the eye for the first time.
Exactly.
This story is wild. So King George III sends Lord Macartney to China to open up trade, and the British are feeling pretty good about themselves at this point. They bring all these gifts, telescopes, air guns, carriages, basically trying to say, look at our tech, you definitely want to be our friends.
Macartney is there to impress Emperor Qianlong. He wants to establish a permanent embassy in Beijing.
Yeah.
He really thinks he's offering China a great opportunity.
And the emperor's reaction is, well, it's icy, right?
It is entirely dismissive. Emperor Qianlong sends a letter back to King George, and this is a real quote from the source. "We have never valued ingenious articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufacturers."
We have no knit for your stuff. That is such a power move.
But it wasn't just arrogance, it was a total clash of worldviews. The British saw the world as a collection of sovereign nations who should naturally trade with each other.
And the Chinese didn't see it that way.
Not at all. The Chinese saw themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the literal center of civilization. In their view, you don't have diplomats residing in Beijing. You have tribute bearers who come to acknowledge the emperor's superiority.
Which explains the whole kowtow controversy. The Chinese wanted Macartney to get on his knees and touch his head to the ground, and Macartney just flat out refused.
It ended in a complete deadlock.
Mm.
But Macartney saw something the emperor missed. He wrote in his journal that the Chinese empire was like an old crazy warship. It looked terrifying on the outside, but it was rotting from the inside and destined to crash.
And he was right, because a few decades later, the British come back. But this time, they aren't bringing telescopes.
No, they're bringing gunboats.
Only opium wars.
Yeah. Yes. This begins with the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. And we really need to pause here because the specific type of defeat China suffered is crucial to understanding their mindset today. China became what the source calls a hypocolony.
Okay, hypocolony. How is that different from just being a regular colony like, say, India was to the British?
Well, in a full colony, the foreign power takes over completely. They run the government, the police, everything. In a hypocolony, the foreign powers, Britain, France, Japan, they just took the best parts.
The best part.
Yeah, they took control of ports, the tariffs, the trade. They carved out zones where Chinese law didn't even apply, but they left the Chinese government technically in charge of the rest of the country.
So the Chinese government had all the responsibility of running a massive country, but none of the actual power.
Exactly. And in some ways, it's almost more humiliating than total conquest. It was a slow, visible dismantling of their sovereignty. They were being eaten alive piece by piece while being told they were still a sovereign country.
That creates a very specific kind of psychological scar.
It really does. Jacques argues that the primary driver of modern China isn't just economic growth, it's the restoration of status.
They want their pride back.
They are trying to erase that century of humiliation and return to what they see as their natural position, the center of the world.
Now here is the plot twist in the source material. While China is crumbling in the 19th century right next door, Japan is doing something completely different. Japan is the only non-Western country to actually industrialize in the 1800s. How did they pull that off when China couldn't?
It comes down to reaction speed and the nature of their elite class. When the American Commodore Perry showed up in Japan with his modern warships in 1853, the Japanese elite, the samurai, they didn't dismiss him like the Chinese emperor did.
They panicked.
They panicked completely.
They saw what was happening to China and said, we need to change fast.
Right. They launched the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The slogan was, "Rich country, strong army." They aggressively copied everything Western: technology, military uniforms, industrial methods. But, and this is the key point for you listening, they did it to protect their Japanese identity, not to replace it.
The source calls this outwardly Western, inwardly Japanese.
It's a hybrid model. Japan proved you can have skyscrapers, trains, and a stock market, but run your society on completely different software.
Let's unpack that software a bit. The source makes a big deal about the difference between guilt culture and shame culture. That sounds a bit academic to me, so what does it actually mean for how regular people act?
It is a generalization, sure, but a very useful one.
Right.
In the West, our morality is largely based on guilt. It's internal.
Right, it's the voice in your head.
Yes. You feel bad because you've violated your own principles or sinned against God, even if no one else saw you do it.
Okay. And in Japan?
In Japan, the regulator is shame. It's external. It's about how your actions reflect on your group, your family, or your company. You feel bad because you've let others down or lost face in the eyes of the community.
So in the West, the core unit is the individual. But in Japan, the unit is the group.
Exactly. And Japan used that group loyalty to build a modern industrial economy that looks absolutely nothing like Western individualism. The Japanese corporation, for example, is often viewed like a family with lifetime obligations.
So if Japan could become an economic superpower while staying culturally distinct, that has huge implications for China.
That is the ultimate warning of the source material. If Japan, which is relatively small, could modernize without westernizing, imagine China.
Right.
China is vastly larger, much
Yeah.
older, and far more self-assured. The idea that China will turn into a giant version of Sweden or America just because they have money is a complete fantasy.
Which leads us to the biggest concept in the book. The source argues that we make a fundamental mistake when we call China a nation-state. Jacques says we should be calling it a civilization state.
Yes, this is the concept that really unlocks everything.
Yeah.
To understand it,
Ballpark.
think about the map of Europe.
It's okay.
Since the fall of Rome, Europe has been fragmented. We have France, Germany, Italy, distinct nations with their own languages and their own borders.
And we organize the whole world based on that European experience. We have the Westphalian system.
Right, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It established the idea that the world is a neighborhood of separate houses.
Each country is a box with a fence.
And inside your fence, you are the boss. All boxes are legally equal on the world stage.
Good fences make good neighbors, right?
That is the Western map. But that is not the Chinese map at all. For 2,000 years, China hasn't been one box among many. It has been a civilization that basically pretends to be a state.
Pretends to be a state.
Because it covers a geographic area comparable to the entire Roman Empire or the modern European Union.
But the EU is a bunch of different countries. China is just one country?
On paper, yes. But look at the diversity within it. And yet, despite all that landmass, the Han Chinese make up over 90% of the population.
90%? That's wild.
That kind of unity on that massive scale is entirely unique in human history. Where Europe splintered into dozens of nations, China constantly coerced itself back into unity over and over again.
So how does a civilization state treat the rest of the world differently than a normal nation state would?
Well, it doesn't view the world as a neighborhood of equal houses. Historically, it viewed the world as a solar system. China is the sun, the Middle Kingdom. The other countries like Korea, Vietnam, Japan, they were planets orbiting the sun.
The tribute system we talked about earlier.
Right, it's a strict hierarchy. You aren't an ally, you're a subordinate. Jacques argues that as China rises today, it's not trying to fit into the Westphalian equal box system. It's slowly rebuilding a system where it is the gravitational center.
And this whole concept changes the relationship between the government and the people too, doesn't it? Because in the West, we're pretty skeptical of the state. We want checks and balances. We view the government as well sometimes as a necessary evil.
Or even an adversary. We actively want to limit its power to protect our individual rights.
Right.
But in the Chinese Confucian tradition, The state isn't a referee or a policeman. It's the head of the family, the patriarch.
So you don't vote for your father.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't limit his power either because his job is to look after the collective welfare of the whole family.
Yeah.
The source emphasizes that in the Chinese psyche, the greatest historical fear isn't tyranny.
It's not. What is it?
It's chaos. It's the family breaking apart. So the government derives its legitimacy not from holding elections, but from its ability to maintain unity and stability at all costs.
So when we sit here and look at China and criticize them for not having Western-style elections, we're judging a civilization state by the rubric of a nation state. We're playing chess and they're playing Go.
We're using completely the wrong measuring stick.
Yeah.
And this matters deeply because China is no longer just staying distinct within its own borders.
Right.
It is actively overtaking the West.
Let's look at the future then. The source brings up economic projections, Goldman Sachs and others, showing the Chinese economy overtaking the U.S. by 2027.
And depending on the metric you use, it's arguably already happening. But the raw numbers are really secondary to the cultural shift. Jacques calls the era we are entering contested modernity.
Contested modernity. That sounds a bit like academic jargon. What does that actually look like on the ground for you and me?
It means the end of the monologue. For the last century, the West did all the talking. We set the standards for what a good economy looks like, what good governance looks like.
We assumed globalization just meant everyone would eventually adopt our values.
Exactly. We assumed globalization was just Westernization on a bigger scale. We see a Starbucks pop up in Beijing and we think, aha, they're becoming like us.
They aren't.
Now, Jacques is saying that's just coffee. The deep cultural structure is completely untouched. In the future, we're going to have multiple modernities competing at the same time. You'll have the Western model, sure, but you'll also have a Chinese modernity, maybe an Indian modernity.
So it's like having different operating systems running on the exact same global network.
Yes. And they will have vastly different definitions of human rights, different views on privacy, different ideas about the role of the state, and the West won't be able to just dismiss them as backward anymore.
Because they'll have the money and the power to back it up.
We will have to deal with them as equals or potentially as superiors in terms of raw power.
That is a seriously humbling reality check. We are moving from a world where the West was the only game in town to a world where we are just one player among many.
And if you view China as just another nation state, you will constantly misread their moves. You have to understand that they are operating on civilizational logic that has been running for 2,000 years.
It seems like the main takeaway here is that we really need to upgrade our own software. We need to learn how to understand a world where progress isn't defined by how much you look like Europe or America.
That is the definitive challenge of the 21st century. Can we live in a world of profound difference without constantly trying to convert everyone else to our way of thinking?
That is a massive question to leave hanging, but I think it's the right one. For everyone listening right now, consider this. If the rules of global success are no longer written in English, are you prepared to adapt to a future defined by a totally different civilization? Martin Jacques. When China rules the world, it's definitely a wake-up call to check your assumptions at the door.
Absolutely. The map we have been using is completely out of date. It is time to draw a new one.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep asking those big questions, and we will catch you on the next one.